Morning, everyone. So this week we're going to be continuing on with week 2 of Advent as we look forward to the time when we celebrate Jesus when he came to earth. And we'll be in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. I'll have them up here on the screen. You want to go ahead and turn there, Luke 2, verses 1 to 7. We're going to be looking at a message of hope. And traditionally, when you do the Advent, there are 4 themes, and week 1 is usually hope. And Mary and I decided not to do that this year, maybe something we'll do in the future. But hope, traditionally within the church, has been one of those main things that. So I had it on mute.
Okay.
So the message of hope has been one of those things that has been central to what the churches believe we are supposed to learn from the story of Jesus. And so it's going to take us a little bit to get there, but at the end we're going to be landing with hope. So go ahead and follow along with me as we read Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. It says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole empire would be registered. This is the first registration that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So everyone went to be registered, each to his own town. Joseph went up from there to the town of Nazareth in Galilee, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Then she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him tightly in a cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks, Connor. So remember, we're looking at Luke, and Luke was not a Jew. He didn't grow up in that culture. He was writing to Theophilus, who was also not a Jew. And so Luke's gospel was very different than Matthew's gospel, which Matthew was a Jew. He grew up in that culture, and he was primarily writing to his first audience would have been to Jews. He's answering a lot of their questions, and he's looking at a lot of the Old Testament scripture. So when we look at the 2 accounts of Jesus' birth, they look very different. They have the same basic content, but how they're laid out is very different. And as like Barry talked about in the beginning of the chapter, there's like this pattern there. And so we see in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 and 24, we see John's birth is predicted to Zechariah. Zechariah doesn't believe the angel, and so he's struck with muteness. And then we see Mary in Luke 1, 26-38. We see that Mary's there. She's predicted the birth of Jesus' birth. And we see that while she's skeptical, she does believe the angel. And then we see that she does become pregnant, even though she is not married, and and she's a virgin. I think we all know how that works. But yet she becomes pregnant. And so Luke 1:46, we see that Mary responds to what God has done, something that only God can do in her life, with worship. So Mary worships God. And then Barry looked at last week, Luke 1:67-80, we see Zechariah's prophecy that when he's finally able to speak, he recognizes what God has done, and he speaks in prophecy and worship. And so what we're going to see over the next 3 weeks, the same pattern is followed. We're going to see this week, we're going to see the story of God. God's going to do something divine, something only God can do. And so we're going to look at that part. And then the next 2 weeks, Barry's going to look at the responses. We're going to see the response of the shepherds, and we're going to see the response of Mary to what God has done. So back to Luke chapter 2, verses 1, and beginning verse 1. It says, "And in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole empire should be registered." Now, this is probably something that Theophilus would have been familiar with, depending on how old he was. Like, he may have actually participated in this registration. We don't know, but this is something that would have regularly gone on and would have been very familiar with him. Same thing in verse 2. We see that the first registration took place while Quirinius was governing Assyria. Probably a place and something to be more familiar. Syria was a pretty prominent part of the trade world, so this is probably an area that would have been familiar to Theophilus. Maybe this leader would have been more familiar with them. So everyone went out to register in his own town. So we had people come door to door. We fill out the paperwork for the census. They actually went to their hometown. So all this would have been really familiar. But then as we start zeroing in on this, we start zeroing in on some of the stuff that probably been less familiar to Theophilus. We know that he's hearing different parts of the story. It seems like he's probably somebody who goes to church. He's hearing the story, but Luke's trying to compile a more comprehensive view of the story in order. So we see that Joseph went up from there to Nazareth, which is in Galilee, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David. So Joseph goes up in the town of Nazareth, where they lived, which is in Galilee, the region. So I think here Luke's, he's trying to paint a picture, trying to help Theophilus understand the geography, because it's probably not geography that he would have been familiar with. Just like a lot of us, we're probably not really familiar with the geography of that area, because he's not from there. He's trying to paint this picture. Well, what do we know about Nazareth? Well, in John 1, verse 46, we see this interaction here between Nathanael and Philip when they're first meeting Jesus, and he's causing them and saying, hey, come follow me. Nathanael says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And so we begin to see this picture that Nazareth is not really a well thought of place. It's kind of an obscure place here, and we get this picture from these verses and other verses in the New Testament that Nazareth really wasn't the place to be from. It's kind of like being a nobody from nowhere, right? And that's kind of what it was like for Jesus. Who's this nobody coming from this nobody place? Jesus was from the wrong place. And what we're going to see here as we walk through this, that humanly speaking, if we were to look at this, it doesn't really look like God is setting up Jesus for the most success here, right? If you're going to place somebody somewhere, being from somewhere, Nazareth is not the place you would want to be from. You want to be a more prominent place, from Jerusalem or Rome or from one of these key cities, not from this place that nobody's ever heard of and is not well thought of. But he continues on, right? Joseph went up from Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem because he was the house and family of David, right? So he goes to Judea, in the region, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, right? So here's the qualifier. We have this another town that probably nobody's ever heard of, other than there's this really famous guy named King David who's from there. So you have this city, this little city that nobody's ever heard of, and the only reason anybody would ever know about it is because there's somebody famous from there. And it's like this place here, Kosciuszko. That is how you actually pronounce it, so if you think I'm making it up, my mom's actually from Kosciuszko County. That's where she was born, in Indiana. So Kosciuszko is a city in Mississippi, right? And you might say, well, why do I care about it? I said, well, it's the county seat of Attala. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that at all. Attala County. But you're like, well, I've never even heard of that. I didn't either. With a population of about 7,500, you're like, great, we have suburbs here in Utah that are 7,500 people. I tell you, it's the hometown of Oprah. Everybody knows Oprah. And when I talk about Kosciuszko, the only thing that you would probably maybe ever care about it is the fact that it's the hometown of your friend and mine, Oprah. Right? And so we don't care about these things, and so he's painting this picture that the only reason that you would care about Bethlehem is it happens to be the hometown of this really famous person named King David. And so you see that Jesus was born, humanly speaking, in the wrong town. If we're going to be from somewhere, and we see that the Bible even talks about this. It says, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah. The Bible admits, hey, this is not really that important. This is a really small place, insignificant place to be from. One will come from you who is the ruler of Israel. His origin is from antiquity, from the Ancient of Days. And we see that he's born in the right town, but he's also born in the right family. And if you never grew up in a small town, I grew up in a town of 1,000 people. We had 1,000 people when I was a senior in high school. It was a pretty big deal. Right? We were the second biggest city in our county. I grew up in rural Midwest America, and if you've never been there, it's just hard. My wife and I walked around the circumference of our town in 45 minutes one day, and we weren't walking very fast. So this is where I'm from. If you've never been there, right, I'm literally related to a third of the town. And then there's this other group of people, this other community, and they're related to a third to a half of the town. And so if you're from like one of these two like loosely connected groups, you're related to pretty much a large portion of the town. And there's a few other people who are just nobodies from nowhere, right? And so we have this, and so there's this like connection there in this small town where it's like, well, if you were born in the town, there's a high likelihood that you're related to one of these prominent groups. My group wasn't the prominent group, but that's a whole other story. The other group was the more prominent family group to be from in the community. But there's this association that if you're from the town, you're probably related to a good chunk of the people because that's how small towns work. You're from there, you're born there, you're related to everybody, and it just doesn't work that way in a big city. And so Jesus is from there, and he was born there, but he's also like related to everybody. And so that's what's going on here. Is there's this intermingling through being born in the right town, but also being born in the right family, and you can't really separate the two in a small town environment. So that's where Jesus is coming from. And then so we see that Jesus went up from Jerusalem to the town of Nazareth in Galilee, to Judea, and I know how to say that, but I can never say that right, in the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house of the family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And so we see here that Joseph and Mary, they're engaged, but she is pregnant. And for the Jews, Matthew spends a lot of time talking about this because to the Jews, this was a really big deal. The fact that they weren't married yet and she was pregnant was a really big deal. But to Theophilus, culturally, it really wasn't a big deal in any other cultures. So this wouldn't have been setting to him, but Matthew spends a lot of time, and we see this in Matthew. It says, so their husband Joseph, being a righteous man, not wanting to disgrace her publicly, decided to divorce her secretly. You see, in the Jewish culture, like once you were engaged, you didn't live together or sleep together, but you were basically married. Like in the law, in the really wasn't covered, but in the religious eyes, you were basically married. And so the only way to break off an engagement was to get divorced, just like you would if you were married. And so it was a big deal to break off an engagement. And if one of the persons was thought to be sleeping around, like Joseph thought Mary might have been, you had the right, according to the law, to publicly disgrace that person. That was the law. You could do that. But Joseph, because he's a righteous man, because he was a good dude, I'm not going to do that to her. You don't have the right to do that. I'm not going to do that to her. But then, and so Jesus had the appearance of being born out of wedlock, which was a really big deal in their culture. This was a really big deal. We actually see this. We see hints of this throughout the gospel, where it appears that the stigma of Jesus being born out of wedlock follows him throughout his ministry. You'll just see like little hints of side comments where it's like people knew the story and what had gone on, and so we see the stigma. And so it was a really big deal for what we see here, that this was part of God's plan. And part of God's plan left Jesus with this stigma for his whole life of being this potentially illegitimate child. But we know that's not actually what had happened. And this is part of what Joseph is told. It says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and his name will be called Emmanuel, or God with us. And so we see that Joseph was told this because it was going to be really detrimental to them in society to have the appearance of being born out of wedlock. But we see that somehow this was in God's plan, that Jesus would be born of a virgin. And I got to the end, and it's like, and then we see here that then she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him tightly in a cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no guest room for them available. This is a story we've all heard, and we look at it from a humanly speaking standpoint. It kind of looks like poor planning, right? And that like maybe we could have come up with a different plan, a better plan, if we wanted this person to be the king and to take over the world and all these things that we see in the Old Testament. It kind of feels like poor planning. But yeah, we're going to see that there's divine providence. In other words, there's things that only God can do in the story that makes it his story. And just like we saw with Zechariah and with Mary, that God has a plan and God's going to do things that only he can do. And there should be a response that we have when God does things that only he can do. And Barry's going to talk about those responses that we see to the story where people begin to respond to God doing something that he can only do. But we're going to have to leave that there. But back to this, it kind of may feel like this. When you look at the plan, right, somehow the model doesn't give me the confidence the scheme will be of the highest quality design, right? And so there's kind of this feeling, but yet we see, we're going to go to Isaiah 53 in the Old Testament, and we're going to see that this was God's plan. And not only know, like he actually knew the effects that his plan was going to have on the story. So we're out of Isaiah 53, we read this. He grew up like a young plant, like a root on a dry ground. He didn't have an impressive form or majesty that we should look at him, nor appearance that we desire him, right? He didn't have an impressive form. Jesus wasn't much to look at, right? And oftentimes when you're picking a king or something, like they picked Saul because he was a head taller than everybody else. Physical appearance to us in the world is really important. And Jesus wasn't anything much to look at physically. Or majesty, that we should look at him. We talked about that. He was a nobody from nowhere. He didn't have any form of majesty, anything that looked like royalty or importance. There was nothing about him that looked anything like that from a world's perspective. No appearance that we should desire him. Nothing that would draw us to him naturally. Therefore, we see this. We see that he was despised and rejected by men. A man suffering who knew what sickness was. Apropos for our group, that Jesus is a man who knows and understands what sickness is. He was like someone people turned away from. He was despised. We didn't value him. We see that God, from the very beginning, that he knew that this was going to be the response to his plan. But yet, this was still his plan. God knew that this was going to happen. And as Barry talked about last week, Zechariah was talking about this coming king, and what they really thought about was that the coming king was this big, mighty warrior who was going to come in and he was going to overthrow the Roman government. And this is what they thought it was going to look like. But yet, we know from the Old Testament that wasn't God's plan. They could have and should have known that, but yet somehow missed that Jesus came in all the ways that people didn't expect, but yet in all the ways that God intended. This was all part of God's plan from the very beginning. But why? When we turn to 1 Peter, starting in verse 18, we see this. It says, "For you know you were redeemed from the empty ways of life inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a spotless, unblemished lamb." And so we see here that one of the words that we use a lot around here, the word redeemed. And we talked about when we were in Titus, the word redeem is a financial, transactional word. This is why we see here, you were redeemed not with perishable things like silver or gold, money. Normally when you redeem something, you redeem it with money. So we're not redeemed with that, but we're redeemed with the precious blood of Jesus Christ, which was spilled for us when he died on the cross. To redeem us from what? Well, very last week, talked about our need to be redeemed from sin and redeemed from the enemy, which is really important. But that's not what we see Peter talking about here specifically. We see him talking about being redeemed from the empty ways of the inherited life of our ancestors. What ancestors is he talking about? Well, the context of 1 Peter, Peter opens up talking to the exiles. Who were the exiles? Well, they were Jews who became Christians and were kicked out of Jerusalem. So Peter's writing to encouraging the Jews. So when he's talking about ancestors, he's talking about Jews. He's talking about people who had the Old Testament. He's talking about people who believed that there was a coming Messiah, who we later find out to be Jesus, that they were coming, and they were ready, and they worshiped God, and they had the temple, they had all these stuff, they had the stories that you and I have from the Old Testament. But yet, though they had all these things, Peter says that they were living in an empty life. Well, what were they missing? Well, here in a minute, Peter's going to tell us. But before we get there, we're going to see this. It says that he, being Jesus, was foreknown before the foundation of the world was revealed. Before the foundation of the world was revealed in these last times for you. So we see that God's plan, this whole redemption plan, that he would come to earth, that he would need to die, was the very plan that God set out before he even started creating everything. God knew out in the future that this was going to happen. You see, some people believe and teach that God is a reactionary God. That, yeah, he's bigger than us, yeah, he's smart enough, but he doesn't really know everything. He not be all-powerful, and he's kind of a reactionary God. But you actually see here that God is so smart, and he would say all-knowing, that he knew before he began in creating everything that we were going to screw everything up, and that he was going to have to provide a way. And so God set this plan out before the foundation of the world. God knew what the plan was, what it was going to look like, and how it was going to come out. And that through this, verse 21 says, and through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. You see, we see what the Jewish people missed through the giving of law was that their faith and hope needed to be in God. See, they somewhere along the line got this misconception that the law was there to show them how to better follow God. And that what they needed was clarity on the rules, right? And it'd be like you who are parents going, well, the reason my kid's disobeying me is always because they just don't have clarity on the rules. So I need to be more clear about how they need to clean the room, or I need to be more clear about, hey, you need to be home at 10 o'clock. And the reason that my kids aren't obeying me is because I'm just not being clear enough on the rules. Well, we all know like how ridiculous that is. But they don't want to clean the room because they don't want to clean the room, and they don't want to get home at 10 o'clock, so that's why they're not home at 10 o'clock. Even no matter how clear we make that, it doesn't mean that they're going to follow the rules. And so in Galatians, Peter tells us that the point of the law was not so that you could have all the rules and be really clear so that you would follow them. The point of the law was to show us, it was our guide, it was our tutor, schoolmasters, lots of words have been trying to use to describe what Paul is saying there, but the point of the law was to point us to not how we can perfectly do it all, but the fact that we couldn't. And so they tried to live this empty life of trying to fulfill all the rules by themselves, and they missed the point that you have to put your faith and hope in God. That you can't do it on your own, you need him. And so the story from the very beginning is that Jesus came and he lived and he died so that you will put your faith and hope in God. And that's what they missed. They missed that Jesus came to redeem us of an empty life and give us a hope, and give us hope, a life of faith and hope in him. Have you traded your empty life for a life of faith and hope in God? Jesus put it this way in another place. He says, a thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come so they may have life and have it in abundance. There's only two options here. We're either living in the life where the thief is coming to steal, kill, and destroy. And that was the result of them trying to focus on themselves and better themselves and follow the law and not put their faith and hope in God, is that they lived a life where the following law was destroying them. And the works of the law, apart from faith in God, will destroy us. Just like Barry talked about last week, that doing the wrong things will also destroy us. We have an enemy who seeks to kill and destroy us, but Jesus says, instead of that, I have come so that you may have life and have it in abundance. You see, we can trade the empty life for a life of faith and hope in God. And just like we talked about with faith, Jesus didn't come to give us faith and hope. He came to give us faith in God. He came to give us hope in God. And the important thing about faith and hope is not that we have it, but it's who is it in? Is your faith and hope in God? Are you living a life of faith and hope for the world to see? This is an often quoted verse out of 1 Peter 3:15, but we often only quote the second half. But in your hearts, honor Christ, the Lord is holy. Always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for reason of the hope that is in you. So we see here that in your Christ, honor the Lord is holy. And the word in the Greek there is an action word, set apart. It's something you actually have to do. We have to set Christ apart as holy in our hearts. We have to make it the first priority. We're not talking about the mind here where we're understanding. We can have all the understanding about who Jesus was and have the correct theology and belief. But it doesn't mean that Christ is not preeminent in your heart. But in your Christ, in your hearts, honor Christ, the Lord is holy. And we see this weird interaction here where Peter doesn't explain it, but he jumps right into always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason of the hope that is in you. And I think what Peter's trying to tell us is there's some connection to being Christ, being preeminent in your heart, first in your heart, having the right place, and people asking for the reason of the hope that is in you. Oftentimes we talk about sharing, and we will continue to talking about being proactive and sharing. That's not what Peter's talking about here. Peter's talking about being ready for people to ask. They have a reason to ask you something. And so we see here that Peter's making this assumption that when Christ is first in your heart, that you're going to be living in such a way that people are going to see that you have hope. And that's why we're doing the Advent series. We all need to be reminded that Jesus came, that God had a plan from the very beginning. And that very beginning should result in us seeing and honoring God in our hearts. That's why the first command is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's where it all starts. And the Jews thought it was all about, even though they knew that that was the first command, they acted like the second part, fulfilling all the rules, was the more important thing. And we will not get the second part right, second command to love our neighbors as self right, if we don't get the first command. And that's why we're doing this, because we all need to be reminded of God and his place he needs to have in our hearts. That's why we need to come to church every week. We need to be regularly here, meeting if you can. If you don't have health issues, if you have health issues and can't, we're completely understanding. We're trying to get into people's homes more and be there, because we all need to be regularly reminded of the place that Christ needs to have in our hearts. So we need to be reading the Bible regularly so that the Word will remind us of the place that Christ needs to have in our hearts. That's why we need to be in prayer. Prayer in itself is, when done correctly, is an act of worship and an act of putting us in dependence of God. And when we're in a spot where we're going, I am dependent upon God, that is why I'm praying. I'm not praying because God's the big vending machine in the sky and I'm trying to get more stuff from him. But I'm realizing that I'm dependent upon God. That is putting Christ in the correct place of the heart. That's why we do these things. Not just because it benefits us, but we need to put Christ in the correct place in our hearts. And we all need to be regularly reminded of that. And that's why we're doing this. And the result will be that we will live a life of hope that people out there will want to know more about. And finally this, are you hopefully waiting for Jesus? A reminder of this so that we saw it at Titus that Barry preached through while we wait for the blessed hope and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. And there's hope in the story that Jesus came once. They waited for thousands of years for Jesus to come, and he came and he fulfilled the promise. And Jesus says that when he comes again, he will receive us unto himself, that where he is, there we will be also. And this time is reminding us not just a hope that was fulfilled in the past, but a hope that is coming in the future, that just like when God promised the first time that he was coming, and he did it, we need to be regularly reminded of that God is coming back. 2020 has kind of been a year of many things, but one of the things it's been is the year of fear. It's been the year of fear of, for some of us, coronavirus. It's been the fear of some of us where our food's going to come from, because people have lost jobs. It's been the fear of what the next 4 years is going to look like from our election. Some of us are living in fear that maybe this is it. We're coming to the end times and things are going to get really bad and Armageddon's going to happen. And we're living in fear of all these things. And Barry talked about how it's okay for everything not to be okay. It's okay to live in that spot of the how long, O Lord. But if we live in that spot of fear, and we're never drawn to the fact that we have to put our faith and hope in Jesus, fear will kill and destroy us. But we know that the promise is that Jesus will come back. And we have to put our faith and hope in him, the one who has the power to fulfill that promise. And so this week, church, will you go, will you put your faith, will you have faith and hope? Not just have it, will you have it in Jesus? Let's pray. God, I pray, Lord, that you would help us to keep our focus on you. God, you do so much for us that we don't even know or recognize. God, I pray, Lord, that we would be a church that puts our faith and hope in you above all else. That as we put our faith and hope in you, God, that people around us will see the hope that we have. That in those times of fear, God, that we'll be reminded of you, and we will not take our eyes off you. Though the fear may not go away, God, we know that our faith and hope in you will not be disappointed. God, I pray, Lord, that you would just help us this week to keep you in our hearts in the proper place, God. May we honor you in our hearts this week as holy. In Jesus' name.